The helicopter's rotors beat the air with deafening force, sending sheets of sand whipping across the desert like a storm made of fire. She sat on the edge, knees tucked close, gripping the straps of her harness with white-knuckled hands. Below her, the desert stretched endlessly waves of golden sand under a sun that already burned hotter than she had ever felt. Her throat was dry, her mouth sticky with anticipation, and yet her mind was razor-focused. This was no ordinary training mission. This was the kind that separated soldiers from warriors, the kind that stripped away every excuse, every comfort, and every weakness. The jump master leaned close, his face barely visible beneath the shadow of his helmet. "You know the rules," he shouted over the rotors, voice rough with years of shouting over wind and metal. "No water. No GPS, no support. You last longer than expected. You survive. You fail. You fail alone." He nodded once, sharply, then jumped back, leaving her on the ledge, the desert sun glaring over her shoulder like a cruel judge. She swallowed, tasting dust in her mouth, her stomach fluttering as adrenaline surged through her veins. This was it. No more drills, no more simulations. Out here, only the desert's law applied. And the desert was merciless. She knew every step she took could be her last if she faltered, if her instincts betrayed her. She glanced over the edge at the endless dunes below, each one a shimmering hill of gold that promised nothing but heat, sand, and isolation. She had trained for this moment for months, her life a cycle of simulations, endurance exercises, and lectures on survival. She knew the basics: conserve energy, stay calm, ration movement, find shade if possible, and never give up. But knowledge and instinct were not always enough when the sun boiled the world and the sand seemed to shift with intent, swallowing everything that dared to challenge it. Her body tensed as she flexed her fingers around the straps. She could do this. She had to. Failure was not an option. The wind tore at her clothes as she leaned forward, testing the edge. Below, the sand stretched endlessly, bright and blinding, a landscape devoid of landmarks. She could feel the sun's weight even before she hit the ground, pressing down like an invisible force. Her boots would dig into that sand, her every step a battle against the desert's slow, silent claim. But she had no choice. She exhaled, held her breath, and let herself go. The drop was immediate. Gravity pulled her down, stomach lurching, and the world became a blur of sky and sand. Wind ripped past her ears, her hair whipped across her face, and for a heartbeat, fear threatened to engulf her. But she centered herself, relying on every drill, every exercise she had ever endured. She had survived waterless marshes, desert simulations, and heat chambers, and she could survive this. Her feet hit the ground with a crunch, sand exploding beneath her boots. She rolled instinctively, letting the impact dissipate through her body. She stood, shaken but unbroken. The helicopter was already a dot above, fading into the blue sky, taking with it any hint of immediate rescue. Alone, she felt the first real taste of the desert's vastness. The sun was merciless, high in the sky, beating down on her head, scorching her neck and arms despite her uniform. Her lips were dry, sand gritty against her teeth, yet she forced herself to take steady breaths. Panic would only burn more energy. She needed control. She needed composure. The first few minutes were a haze of shock and disorientation. She adjusted her pack, checking her minimal supplies: a small survival kit, basic rations, and a knife. No water. The realization settled like a stone in her stomach. Hours without hydration would test her limits more than any physical obstacle ever could. But she was trained for this. Survival was as much about mental fortitude as physical endurance. She forced herself to walk, sinking into the sand, boots making slow progress. Every step felt like dragging lead through her muscles, yet she kept moving. The sun blazed overhead, relentless. She scanned the dunes, noting patterns in the wind, the subtle shadows that hinted at shifts in terrain. Survival was about observation as much as endurance. Tiny differences in the sand, the slope of a dune, the shimmer of distant mirages, all could guide her. Her throat burned, her lips splitting, but she refused to yield to the discomfort. Sweat ran down her back, stinging the scratches from her uniform, but she let it drip, a small victory against the oppressive heat. Hours passed, though time lost meaning under the unyielding sun. She discovered small obstacles she had not anticipated, sand dunes collapsing underfoot, hidden rocks threatening sprained ankles, heat waves distorting reality. She paused only briefly, leaning on her knees, inhaling hot, dry air, and forced herself onward. Every movement had to be deliberate. Every decision could mean life or death. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she kept walking, step by careful step. She thought of home, of family, of why she had chosen this life. She thought of the pride in her squad leader's eyes when she had volunteered for this mission. She thought of herself, stubborn and unbroken, refusing to let the desert claim her. With every step, she reinforced a single truth: giving up was not an option. This mission was not only a test of survival, it was a test of identity. She had trained to endure, to withstand, and to conquer. And that's exactly what she intended to do. By late afternoon, the desert seemed to stretch infinitely. The sun's angle made the sand glare like a living, breathing entity. She stumbled occasionally, boots sliding, sand clinging to sweat and tears, but she rose again. Her shadow stretched long behind her, a dark line against the endless gold, a reminder that she was still here, still alive. Each small success, a steady breath, a controlled step, a moment without panic, was a victory she silently celebrated. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to creep in. Her limbs felt heavy, her mind wandered briefly to the inevitability of failure. But then she remembered every survival exercise she had endured, every lesson drilled into her. The desert might be vast, hot, and merciless, but her mind was sharper than any sun-bleached dune. She adjusted her pack again, feeling the straps cut into her shoulders, but she didn't stop. She focused on the next step, the next footfall. Survival was not about the end. It was about persistence. Evening approached, and with it, a slight cooling of the sand. Shadows lengthened, and the sun's fire became less punishing. She welcomed the relief, taking advantage of the lower heat to push herself further. She began looking for natural shelters, small depressions, rock formations, anything that might provide shade or reduce exposure. The desert was still harsh, but now it offered brief opportunities to catch her breath. She moved cautiously, alert to every sound, every shift in the wind, knowing predators weren't just animals. They were heat, thirst, and fatigue. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, she had covered miles of barren terrain. Her body ached, but she was still moving. Alone in the desert, with no water and no immediate help, she had proven she could endure. Each breath came with effort, each step with pain, yet she refused to surrender. She had survived the first part of the mission, and in doing so, she had begun writing the story that would test her limits and redefine them. She finally paused, squatting behind a small ridge for shelter, letting the wind wash over her, drying sweat and sand from her eyes. For a brief moment, she closed them, allowing herself a sliver of calm. The desert was still waiting, still dangerous, still unforgiving. But she had faced it head-on and remained standing. And that was the first victory of many. The desert sun rose higher, a relentless orb in a cloudless sky, beating down with a ferocity that seemed unnatural, almost personal. Each grain of sand shimmered in the heat, creating illusions that twisted and shifted with the wind. A young soldier trudged forward, her boots sinking into the soft dunes with every step, leaving shallow footprints that would soon be erased by the merciless wind. The weight of her pack, the constant drag of her uniform, and the lack of water made every movement a struggle against not just the desert, but her own body. Her lips were cracked and raw, every swallow of hot, dry air a reminder of the thirst gnawing at her from the inside out. She adjusted the straps of her pack, wincing as sweat-soaked fabric rubbed painfully against her shoulders. Her hands were blistered, dust and sand ground into the skin from her repeated movements. She paused briefly, crouching behind a small dune to catch her breath. The heat radiated off the sand in waves, distorting the horizon into a shimmering mirage. In the distance, she thought she saw the glint of water, but it vanished as she focused on it, a cruel trick of the desert. The desert was unforgiving in ways that weren't always visible. Loose sand caused her to slip, hidden rocks threatened twisted ankles, and the blazing sun threatened heat stroke with every passing hour. She adjusted her scarf around her face, trying to block some of the searing wind and grit, but even that offered little protection. Her eyes, dry and burning, scanned endlessly for any signs of change, any clue that survival was still possible. Every shadow, every contour of the sand became a landmark in the otherwise infinite landscape, a fleeting anchor in a world designed to disorient and challenge. She remembered the drills, the survival courses, the instructor's warnings: conserve energy, avoid unnecessary movement, and keep mental control. The physical challenges were one thing, but it was the mental test that would decide if she lived or succumbed. Her thoughts began to wander, not out of distraction, but as a strategy. Focusing on memories of home, of training, of past victories, helped her regulate her breathing and steady her pulse. It was strange, she thought, how much the mind could hold on to, even as the body begged for relief. Water, or the lack thereof, was an ever-present specter. Her tongue felt swollen, her throat burned like sandpaper, and her stomach grumbled ominously, echoing the slow betrayal of her body. She tried to ration her energy, moving deliberately, conserving strength for the hour she still had to endure. She forced herself to stay upright, to push past dizziness and fatigue. Each step was a negotiation with pain. Foot forward, breathe, step, repeat. She measured the rhythm of her movement as if it were a lifeline, each beat a reminder that giving up was not an option. Time became fluid, meaningless. The sun's relentless glare shifted slightly, stretching shadows longer and then shorter, but the heat never relented. Her legs ached, muscles trembling from exertion and dehydration. She tripped over a hidden rock, falling hard, sand scattering across her uniform and into her hair. She lay there for a few seconds, chest heaving, hands pressing against the sand to pull herself upright. The pain was sharp, immediate, but temporary. She had faced discomfort before: injuries, bruises, fatigue, but this was the first time she had felt truly at the mercy of the desert's complete indifference. Every step forward required focus. Loose sand made her progress slow, her boots sometimes sliding backward despite her effort. She cursed under her breath, a sound swallowed by the vast openness around her. She thought of all the soldiers who had attempted similar survival exercises, some who had failed, some who had barely endured. She wasn't going to be counted among the failures. Her jaw clenched, and she pushed onward, using the memory of every grueling drill and simulation she had survived as fuel. Mirages appeared in the distant pools of sparkling water, green patches of impossible vegetation, but she didn't allow herself the frustration of believing them. Each illusion was a test of mental discipline, a trick of the mind in the heat. She kept her focus on her path, on what she could control. Every time her foot sank too deep into the sand or she stumbled, she reminded herself, control was survival. Panic would only shorten her endurance, and she refused to succumb. As the day stretched into afternoon, exhaustion became her constant companion. Her body felt like lead, each step an act of willpower. Sweat soaked her uniform, leaving salt streaks on her skin. Her lips were dry and cracked, her mouth tasting of dust and grit. Her throat burned relentlessly, reminding her that every second without water was a second closer to collapse. And yet, despite the heat, the exhaustion, and the isolation, she walked on. She counted steps when she could, measured distances by the shifting sun, and tracked the subtle signs in the sand to maintain direction. Small victories kept her moving. A slight shadow offering temporary relief, a small rock formation she could use to rest without exposing herself fully to the sun, the occasional cool draft of air that whispered across the dunes. She adjusted her scarf again, wiped sweat from her brow, and forced herself to keep walking. Every step was deliberate, every breath calculated. The desert tested her body, but she relied on mental fortitude to survive. Her mind wandered, a mix of self-encouragement and determination. She reminded herself that this was training, a test designed to stretch her limits. It was not punishment. It was preparation for the impossible. She pictured herself returning to base victorious, a disbelief in her comrades' eyes as she recounted her endurance. That vision, however small, became a source of strength. She forced herself to focus on each step, each footfall, as if the desert had no end and she alone could define it. Hours passed with the sun blazing overhead. Her shadow shortened and lengthened with the day, a silent witness to her perseverance. She stumbled, fell briefly into the sand, and pressed her hands against the scorching surface to steady herself. Dust clung to sweat-soaked skin, sand ground into every crease, yet she persisted. Pain was temporary. Survival required determination. Her lips cracked further, her throat screamed for moisture, but she pressed onward, step by step. Every hour she survived, every mile she crossed, strengthened her resolve. By late afternoon, the desert began to shift. Heat waves rippled across the dunes, creating illusions of rivers and oases. She paused briefly, catching her breath, letting her gaze sweep across the endless landscape. Every mirage reminded her of the stakes, but she refused distraction. She thought of water again, how desperately she wanted it, but she forced herself to ration not just energy but hope. Hope was dangerous if uncontrolled. She focused instead on movement, on maintaining posture, on staying upright. As the sun began its slow descent, she noted the slight drop in temperature. It wasn't relief, it was a subtle change, barely noticeable, but it offered a brief respite. She welcomed the cooler air, using it to push further, to maintain her rhythm. Every dune she crossed was a victory. Every step taken despite exhaustion reinforced her resilience. She kept track of her surroundings, using the shadows of rocks and dunes to judge direction. She was alive. She was moving. She was enduring. And the desert, no matter how cruel, had not yet claimed her. Night would soon fall, bringing its own challenges, but she was prepared. Her body screamed, her throat burned, her feet ached, but she had survived the peak of the sun's fury. That first, brutal stretch had been conquered. She had tested her body, her mind, and her will against the desert's harshest trial, and for now, she had survived. Each step forward was a testament not only to training, but to an unyielding spirit that refused to surrender, no matter the cost. The desert stretched endlessly around her, vast and unforgiving, like a living organism with no mercy. Her boots dug into the shifting sand, each step a struggle against not only the ground, but the relentless sun above. Sweat poured down her body, stinging her eyes, running down the back of her neck, and soaking into her uniform. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Every joint felt like it had been filled with fire. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked, and the once sharp clarity of her mind began to blur. For hours she had marched through the dunes, following an invisible path etched into her memory from training, counting every step, measuring every breath. But fatigue had begun to gnaw at her focus. Her vision wavered, mirages danced across the horizon, and the once clear landmarks she had memorized seemed to melt into the golden heat. She stumbled over a hidden rock, barely catching herself before she fell face first into the sand. She gasped, sand scraping against her dry lips and burned skin. Panic threatened to rise in her chest, a dangerous spark in the heat, but she forced herself to remain calm. Dropping to her knees, she pressed her palms into the scorching sand, the grains almost unbearable against her sweat-skid skin. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, and for the first time, a whisper of doubt crept into her mind. What if she didn't make it? What if the desert claimed her here, in this endless expanse of heat and silence? She shook her head, trying to banish the thoughts. Fear would only drain her energy faster. Survival demanded focus, and focus demanded discipline. She inhaled deeply, savoring the harsh, dry air, and pushed herself to stand again. Every step forward was agony. Her legs trembled beneath her, knees buckling under the strain. Her feet were blistered, soles raw from endless contact with hot sand and unforgiving boots. Sweat-soaked clothing clung to her body, every movement a reminder of the weight of endurance. She paused briefly, scanning the horizon for anything familiar, any hint of change, any glimmer of hope. But the desert offered none. The dunes rippled endlessly, and the sun burned overhead, relentless and indifferent. The mental toll was just as severe as the physical. Fatigue clouded her judgment, whispering insidious lies. She imagined water in the distance, only to watch it vanish as she focused on it. Every illusion tested her willpower, every mirage a trap for the mind. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to ignore the hallucinations, to concentrate only on measurable progress, step by step, dune by dune, hour by hour. The desert would not break her, not yet. Her lips were raw, and her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. She tried to wet them with saliva, but it barely helped. Every swallow was agony. Her throat burned constantly, a reminder that she had no water, that each passing moment brought her closer to the limits of human endurance. Yet even in this extreme thirst, she maintained a small ritual of focus. She recited her training lessons silently, counting her breaths, calculating distances, memorizing the sun's position. The desert demanded mental as well as physical endurance, and she would meet both. Exhaustion began to affect her coordination. She misjudged the distance between dunes, slipping in loose sand, barely catching herself before falling. Her hands, blistered and raw from gripping her pack and scrambling over uneven terrain, trembled. Even the smallest movements required careful calculation. She forced herself to slow down, to conserve energy wherever possible, knowing that one misstep in fatigue could mean injury or worse. Every dune was a new test, every gust of wind a fresh challenge. The desert showed no mercy, and she had no backup, no support, no way to escape except forward. Despite the suffering, she found moments of clarity. The desert, cruel and endless, had a strange rhythm to it. She learned to read the patterns of sand and wind, to judge the firmness of dunes before stepping, to spot subtle shadows that hinted at obstacles. Each observation was a small victory, a way to conserve energy, a way to survive. Even as her body ached and her mind wavered, she clung to these tiny advantages, understanding that endurance was not just brute strength, it was awareness, strategy, and mental resilience. The sun moved slowly, inching toward the horizon, casting long shadows that briefly cooled the sand under her feet. She used these moments to press forward, leveraging every advantage the desert offered. Her body screamed with pain, muscles tight, joints aching, lungs burning, but she pressed on. The physical agony was immense, yet the mental fight was greater. She forced herself to focus on the next step, the next dune, the next breath. Giving up was not an option. Survival required relentless persistence. Mirages continued to torment her. Pools of sparkling water, distant palm trees, the illusion of shade, they all teased her, promising relief that didn't exist. Each time she ran toward them in hope, disappointment struck, forcing her to stop and recalibrate. It was a psychological war, and she was determined to win. She reminded herself that the desert had no illusions over her mind's strength. She would endure, step by step, dune by dune, until the day's light faded. By late afternoon, her pace had slowed, but she was still moving. Her body felt like lead, every joint threatening to give out, yet she refused to collapse. Each step required concentrated effort, each breath a negotiation with exhaustion. She found a small ridge of sand to rest behind, crouching low to conserve what little energy she had left. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the wind wash over her, but sleep was a danger she couldn't afford. The desert would not forgive a lapse in vigilance. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp enough to survive. She calculated the sun's angle, judged the distance between dunes, and planned every footfall with care. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could lead to injury, dehydration, or worse. The desert tested not only strength but precision, and she knew she could not allow herself even a moment's carelessness. Her thoughts became rhythmic, almost meditative, a mantra of survival repeating with every step. Move forward, conserve energy, endure. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped slightly, but the sand remained scorching, radiating heat that sapped her energy. Her shadow stretched behind her, a dark ribbon across the golden dunes, marking each step she had survived. She pushed herself harder, knowing that every hour endured brought her closer to the possibility of rescue, or at least the end of the day's most punishing heat. Her focus was absolute, her will unbroken, even as her body screamed for reprieve. Her lips cracked further, her tongue swollen, and every swallow was agony. Her throat ached unbearably, and she fought the rising panic that whispered, "You can't make it." She breathed deeply, counting each inhalation, focusing on the rhythm of her movement. Step, breathe, one foot in front of the other. She could survive. She would survive. The desert might be vast, merciless, and scorching, but she refused to surrender to it. She would endure, even if it killed her to keep moving. Hours bled together. The sun's brilliance began to soften, but fatigue had intensified to a nearly unbearable degree. Her limbs shook uncontrollably, her feet ached from contact with the relentless sand, and her vision wavered with exhaustion and dehydration. Yet despite the physical and mental torment, she remained upright. She reminded herself of why she was here, of the challenge she had accepted, and of the promise she had made to never yield. Every step was a victory. Every moment of survival was proof of her strength. By evening, as shadows stretched across the dunes and the heat became slightly more bearable, she realized she had endured far longer than she had expected. Her body was screaming, her throat burned with thirst, and her energy reserves were near depletion, yet she had survived the desert's peak hours. She had been tested, and the test had not broken her. The first true signs of weakness had appeared: dizziness, trembling limbs, and moments of doubt, but she had resisted every one. And in that resistance, she found her strength. She paused behind a small ridge as the sun began to set, looking back at the endless waves of sand she had crossed. Her chest heaved, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she allowed herself a brief sense of pride. She had endured, had pushed through pain, thirst, and isolation. The desert had tried to break her, but she had endured. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat had been a victory against impossible odds. And in that small triumph, she found the courage to continue, knowing the night would bring new challenges. The desert had quieted into a deceptive stillness. Even the wind seemed to have paused, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the sand. Every sound was amplified in the emptiness, the faint rustle of loose grains, the distant call of a lone bird, the subtle shift of a rock beneath her boot. Her body was exhausted beyond measure, yet her senses remained hyper-aware. She could feel the weight of each step, the drag of every muscle, and the ache of every joint. But something new lingered at the edges of her awareness, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the air. At first, she thought it was nothing. Fatigue had warped her perception, conjured phantom sounds. The desert played tricks on the mind. Yet there it was again, a low, steady hum, faint but distinct, like a heartbeat echoing across the dunes. She froze, squinting toward the horizon. The sound grew stronger, rhythmic and unmistakable. Rotor blades. Her heart leapt, pounding violently against her ribcage. She blinked rapidly, unsure if her eyes could trust what her ears were telling her. Could it be real? Could it truly be a helicopter approaching through this vast wasteland? Her mind raced. She scanned the horizon with bleary eyes, trying to pick up any movement, any hint of a black silhouette cutting through the golden sands. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging, but she refused to blink it away. The sound grew louder, reverberating in the emptiness. Every nerve in her body hummed with anticipation, her exhaustion momentarily pushed aside by a surge of adrenaline. Could this be the rescue she had barely allowed herself to imagine for hours? She had been alone in the desert for what felt like an eternity, fighting the relentless sun, battling dehydration, and keeping her mind sharp against the hallucinations. And now maybe the desert itself was delivering a sign. The vibration shifted with the wind, rising and falling in pitch, as though breathing in time with her own heartbeat. She lifted her head, scanning the dunes carefully, noting the shadows, the contours, the ridges, searching for any irregularity. And then she saw it, a black shape, distant and flickering, moving against the bright horizon. Her pulse jumped. It was small at first, barely perceptible, but growing larger by the second. The metallic glint of the rotor blades caught the fading sun, flashing like a beacon across the dunes. This was real. She was not hallucinating. Her legs, which had trembled from exhaustion only moments before, found a burst of energy. She staggered forward, eyes wide, squinting against the glare of the sun. Sand crunched beneath her boots, each step heavier than the last, yet she moved with a renewed determination. This could be the lifeline she had prayed for without realizing it. Her throat burned with thirst, her lips cracked, but hope surged through her veins like liquid fire, invigorating every fiber of her body. She had endured so much to get here, and now there was the possibility of salvation. But doubt still lingered. The desert had deceived her countless times, mirages, hallucinations, heat-induced illusions. She forced herself to remain cautious, scanning every ripple of sand, every shadow. The helicopter was real, yes, but what if it was part of the exercise? What if the drill required her to maintain composure under the sudden excitement of hope? Her training had prepared her for moments like this, to remain vigilant, to measure risk, and to think clearly, even when every instinct screamed to run blindly toward safety. Her breathing grew rapid, each inhalation hot and dry, each exhalation a hiss in the sand-choked air. She wiped sweat from her brow, feeling the grit of sand stick to her skin. Yet she kept her eyes fixed on the silhouette above the horizon. The sound of the rotors grew louder, shaking the very air around her, whipping loose grains into small storms that stung her face. The helicopter was approaching, cutting across the desert with terrifying precision, and she could no longer deny the truth. Help had come. For a fleeting moment, disbelief gripped her. Hours of struggle, hours of pushing herself to the limits, and now the possibility of rescue seemed almost too good to be real. Her mind flashed to all the soldiers she had heard about who hadn't survived similar drills. She had endured longer than anyone had expected, and yet here she was, facing a lifeline descending from the sky. Her pulse raced, and her body trembled not from exhaustion alone, but from the incredible surge of relief, hope, and anticipation coursing through her. She crouched low behind a small ridge, shielding herself from the sand and wind whipped up by the helicopter above. The noise was deafening, yet it was a symphony of life in her ears. She raised a trembling arm, waving it weakly, signaling her position, though she wasn't sure if they could see her through the swirling dust. Her throat was raw from screaming a moment ago, and she had no strength to call out. Instead, she let her body and her instinct communicate. She was here, alive, and in need of aid. The helicopter's shadow stretched across the dunes, growing larger with every second. She felt the ground tremble beneath her, felt the air pressure shift as the chopper descended. The rotors tore at her uniform, sand and grit stinging her eyes and mouth, yet she held her position. Her training told her to stay steady, to avoid sudden movements that could unbalance her in the loose sand. It was a delicate dance, every movement measured, every step intentional. She was exhausted beyond belief, but adrenaline and hope pushed her forward. Her mind raced with questions, though none were answered yet. Who was inside? Was it a routine check, or had someone actually noticed she was still alive? Could they rescue her safely in this terrain? She didn't have the energy to dwell on the uncertainties for long. Every second counted, and she focused on the immediate. Remain visible, maintain composure, prepare to be lifted from the desert. She inhaled deeply, the hot air burning her lungs, and steeled herself for whatever was about to happen. As the helicopter drew closer, the sound of the rotors became a physical presence, shaking her body with each beat. The pilot had her in sight, she realized, seeing the distinct shape of her uniform and the faint shimmer of movement against the golden sand. She waved more deliberately now, her hand trembling with exhaustion, but determined to signal life, persistence, and readiness. She was here, alone, but unbroken. The desert had tried to crush her, and yet she remained upright. The approaching chopper was proof that her effort had not gone unnoticed. Finally, she allowed herself a small, shaky smile, the first real expression of relief in hours. She hadn't yet been rescued, but hope had arrived, tangible and undeniable. Her legs quivered, her body threatened to collapse under fatigue, but she pressed forward slightly, signaling again with renewed determination. Every second she endured now was a victory in itself, every breath a testament to her resilience. The helicopter hovered closer, its shadow falling fully over her position, and she felt the first spark of certainty. She would not be left here to the desert's merciless mercy. Even as exhaustion weighed her down, the sound of the rotors and the looming silhouette of the helicopter became a mantra in her mind. She had endured, she had survived, and now she would be lifted from the desert by forces she had only dared imagine. But survival was not yet complete. She braced herself, every nerve on high alert, knowing the approach of help carried its own risks in such treacherous terrain. The desert was unpredictable, but she had earned every moment of hope she felt. Every movement of the helicopter seemed to correspond with her heartbeat. She counted each beat, each gust of rotor wind, each shifting shadow, holding herself ready for the final approach. Her body shook from exhaustion, her lips cracked, her throat burned, yet she remained steadfast. She had faced the worst the desert could throw at her: extreme heat, dehydration, hallucinations, exhaustion. And now she faced the final test, enduring long enough for rescue to reach her. She was alive, but the mission of survival was not yet over. The helicopter drew ever closer, the shadow now a solid, looming presence over her position. She crouched low, grit and sweat stinging her eyes, waiting for the next moment that would change everything. The desert had pushed her to her absolute limits, tested every fiber of her being, and now, after hours of relentless struggle, the first tangible sign of hope had arrived. She was not alone. The hum of rotors, once distant and uncertain, now filled her ears with promise. She had survived. The roar of the helicopter was deafening now, a mechanical thunder that shook the sand and vibrated through her bones. Her body, already frayed and exhausted, trembled not from weakness alone, but from the sheer intensity of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The rotors sliced the air above her, whipping up walls of sand that stung her eyes, face, and arms. She crouched low behind a small ridge, pressing her palms into the hot grains beneath her, trying to stay steady against the force of the downdraft. Her boots dug into the sand to anchor her, each step a struggle against both gravity and exhaustion. She raised her trembling arm higher, waving frantically to catch the attention of the pilots. Dust swirled around her like a miniature sandstorm, partially obscuring her presence, yet she forced herself to remain visible, a signal of life amid the endless desert. Every second stretched into an eternity as she waited, muscles quivering from fatigue, heart hammering in her chest like a drum of war. The helicopter had spotted her. She could feel it in the subtle adjustments of its shadow, the way it hovered over the uneven dunes. But she knew that survival was far from assured until she was safely aboard. The downdraft intensified, sand whipping violently into her hair and eyes. She blinked rapidly, shielding her face as the helicopter's shadow grew larger, the black silhouette casting an oppressive, moving blot across the sun-baked sand. Every instinct screamed caution. The rotor wash could throw her off balance at any moment. She crouched lower, gripping the strap of her pack and pressing herself into the earth. Her legs, trembling under the strain of hours of walking and dehydration, fought to keep her upright. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to maintain stability while remaining as visible as possible. The helicopter hovered closer, and for the first time, she could make out the SEALs leaning out from the open doors, scanning the desert floor with practiced eyes. Their gaze met hers, and she held her position, waving with both hands now, signaling with every ounce of strength she had left. She stumbled slightly as a sudden gust of wind threw her balance off, but she caught herself just in time, her body quivering, chest heaving from exertion. The seconds stretched painfully as the pilots communicated over their headsets, making final adjustments to position the helicopter over her. Her throat was raw from screaming in earlier moments of panic and relief, and each breath was hot and painful, carrying grit and dust that scratched her mouth. Yet she forced herself to inhale steadily, focus narrowing on one objective: stay upright until they reached her. Hours in the desert had taught her that every misstep, every lapse in concentration, could mean disaster. She remembered each survival lesson in detail: the importance of footing, maintaining balance, controlling breathing, and reading environmental cues. None of it had been theoretical. Every principle was being tested in real time, and she was acutely aware that failure was not an option. The helicopter's shadow now covered her completely, a moving canopy of metal and power. The downdraft nearly knocked her to the ground, whipping sand into her eyes and ears. She pressed herself harder into the ridge, digging her fingers into the grains of sand to stabilize her body. Her strength was waning, her muscles screaming, yet her resolve remained unbroken. She focused on the faces of the SEALs above, the determination in their eyes, and she drew a final reservoir of energy from sheer willpower. She would not collapse before reaching safety. One of the seals pointed down, signaling to the others, and she understood that the extraction was about to begin. The helicopter adjusted slightly, hovering lower to create a more stable downdraft for descent. The air pressure shifted violently around her, lifting sand into swirling clouds that made visibility nearly impossible. She wiped grit from her eyes, squinting against the burning sun, and shifted her stance carefully, lowering herself into a semi-crouch to remain steady. Her mind raced with calculations. The wind, the rotor wash, the slight slope of the dune, and the timing of the seal's jump. Every detail mattered. A second seal leapt from the open door, landing a few meters away with precise control despite the shifting sand. She watched, awestruck despite her exhaustion, as the soldier advanced toward her with confident, measured steps. The downdraft tossed sand into their faces, yet the seal moved as if the desert were just another training ground. Seeing him made her stomach tighten with a mixture of relief and renewed stress. The moment of contact was near, and she knew she had to maintain control of her body to survive the next critical seconds. Her legs trembled violently as the seal approached. She had been upright for hours, fighting the desert's fury, yet now she faced the immediate physical challenge of the rotowash, combined with the exertion of reaching the extraction point. She braced herself, pressing into the sand, feeling the grains shift beneath her feet. Her throat burned, lungs gasping for air, but she held herself steady, arms raised to signal readiness. This was the final stage, the moment where survival hung in a delicate balance. The seal reached her side, extending strong, steady hands. "Here we go," he shouted over the roar of the rotors, his voice cutting through the chaotic noise. Her heart surged, adrenaline flooding her system as she prepared to move. Every muscle screamed in protest, yet she obeyed instinctively, placing her hands in his and allowing herself to be guided. She felt the reassuring pressure of strength, the solid grip that promised safety if she could just hold on for a few more seconds. With a careful, coordinated effort, the seal helped her to maneuver toward the helicopter's cable ladder. Each step was deliberate, the rotowash threatening to throw her off balance. Sand whipped into her eyes and mouth, but she forced herself to keep her focus narrow upward forward to safety. She could hear the communication between the pilots, adjustments in position, the careful timing of their movements. It was a delicate operation, and she understood the stakes. One misstep, and the extraction could fail. Her legs felt like lead, but the SEAL's guidance provided stability. She moved step by step, gripping the ladder, the metal cold against her blistered hands. She swallowed hard, trying to fight the dryness in her throat, but there was no time to dwell on discomfort. Each rung she climbed brought her closer to survival, each inch upward of victory over the desert that had tested her to the absolute limit. Her breath came in ragged gasps, muscles trembling, but determination surged stronger than exhaustion. As she neared the helicopter's open door, the final gust of rotor wind threatened to push her backward. She planted her feet firmly, gripping the ladder with renewed focus. The seal at her side guided her with precise instructions, ensuring that every movement was deliberate and controlled. She felt the relief of almost being aboard, the promise of safety, yet the desert still demanded caution. One false move could undo everything. She concentrated on her grip, her footing, and the synchronization with the seal beside her. Finally, with a collective effort, she reached the top of the ladder and swung herself into the helicopter. Hands grabbed her arms, pulling her fully inside, and she collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but alive. The roar of the rotors filled the cabin, but the sensation of safety, of being lifted above the desert's cruel expanse, was overwhelming. Her chest heaved, sweat and grit clinging to her skin, as she finally allowed herself to rest for the first time in hours. She had endured, resisted, and survived the desert's relentless test. The seals around her exchanged nods, expressions a mixture of respect and astonishment. She had been upright, alert, and persistent in conditions that would have crushed most soldiers within hours. The helicopter lifted off, ascending into the sky, leaving the unforgiving desert behind. For the first time, she could breathe without immediate fear, drink water without rationing, and begin to process the extraordinary ordeal she had survived. She was alive, and she had proven beyond doubt that her spirit could endure even the harshest conditions imaginable. The moment her body was lifted into the helicopter, the roar of the rotors consumed everything else. Sand, wind, and the oppressive heat of the desert were instantly replaced by the confined, vibrating cabin. She collapsed onto the floor, every limb trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion. The rough metal pressed against her blistered skin, sweat mixing with sand and dirt, but she barely noticed. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, each breath a hot, rattling reminder of how close she had come to collapsing in the desert's cruel expanse. Around her, the SEAL team moved with precision and efficiency, securing themselves and assessing her condition, even as the helicopter ascended. One of them crouched beside her, voice calm yet commanding. "You weren't supposed to last this long," he said, eyes scanning her body for signs of serious injury or dehydration. She blinked at him, lips cracked and dry, unable to speak immediately. Her throat burned, and the dryness made her words rasp when she finally attempted them. Her voice was weak, but it carried determination. She had survived. That fact alone was undeniable. A canteen was thrust into her hands, and she drank greedily, the liquid burning and soothing her throat at the same time. Her body trembled with both exhaustion and relief. Each swallow of water was a tiny triumph over the hours of relentless thirst, a tangible reward for the sheer endurance she had demonstrated. The helicopter bounced slightly with the rotor-wash and turbulent air, but she didn't care. She had survived the desert's worst, and this moment of respite, no matter how brief or chaotic, was all she needed. Her mind raced even as her body quaked with fatigue. The adrenaline that had carried her through the desert still lingered, mixing with relief and a dawning disbelief. She had endured everything the desert had thrown at her blistering heat: parched lips and throat, hallucinations, fatigue, and isolation, and had survived. The thought was both overwhelming and grounding. She had faced her limits and gone beyond them. The helicopter, with its walls rattling and the roar of rotors filling every corner, now symbolized both a conclusion and a new beginning. The SEALs moved around her like a well-rehearsed team, securing themselves and checking equipment, even as they maintained constant awareness of the desert terrain below. One of them leaned in, voice low but steady. "You've pushed yourself further than we ever expected. Most soldiers wouldn't last a few hours in these conditions. You've gone far beyond." She nodded weakly, too exhausted to smile, yet inside, a quiet pride burned fiercely. She had survived against the odds, and now the men who had trained her, guided her, and assessed her would acknowledge her extraordinary endurance. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she slowly tried to adjust her position on the metal floor. Her legs shook violently, knees threatening to buckle even in the safety of the helicopter cabin. Her arms ached from gripping the straps during the final moments of extraction. Sweat mixed with sand and dirt, running down her back as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Even though the immediate danger of the desert was behind her, her body was still fully engaged in a recovery battle. Each breath was deliberate, calculated to maximize oxygen intake and calm her racing heartbeat. The cabin smelled of metal, sweat, and the faint tang of fuel, a stark contrast to the dry, sandy desert air outside. The vibrations from the rotors reverberated through her bones, but they no longer carried the threat of injury. They were merely a reminder of her journey, Her survival had been validated not only by endurance, but by the fact that she had been extracted alive and relatively unharmed. The sheer contrast between the chaos outside and the confined, controlled environment inside emphasized how far she had come. A seal knelt beside her, checking her pulse and observing the signs of dehydration. Dry lips, sunburned skin, and a faint dizziness. His hands were strong, efficient, and steady, a reminder that she was no longer alone in the fight for survival. She allowed herself to relax slightly, trusting their experience. Yet the tremor in her limbs reminded her that her ordeal was far from over. Survival was no longer just about endurance. It was now about recovery and regaining strength in preparation for whatever lay ahead. The helicopter cabin was filled with controlled activity. One SEAL relayed coordinates to the pilot, another monitored fuel levels and altitude, while yet another ensured her safety on the floor. Despite the organized chaos, the calm professionalism of the team provided a strange reassurance. Every movement, every word, was deliberate and efficient, underscoring the competence and preparedness of those who had saved her. She had been alone in the desert, but now, under the vigilant watch of the SEALs, she felt a fragile but growing sense of security. Her throat was still raw and burning, yet she attempted to speak. "Thank you," she rasped, voice barely audible over the rotors. One of the SEALs gave a small nod, acknowledging both her effort and gratitude. Words were unnecessary. Her presence, endurance, and survival spoke louder than any phrase could. The team around her recognized what she had achieved, surviving hours in the desert with no water, no shade, and no support. It was a feat that required not only physical strength, but extraordinary mental resilience. The helicopter bounced slightly as it navigated turbulent air currents, sandstorms still lingering in patches below. She felt the instability beneath her, but no longer feared it. The desert could no longer reach her. She focused instead on stabilizing her breathing, letting the water she had sipped flow down her parched throat, and allowing her body to begin the slow process of recovery. Every inch of her body that had endured excruciating fatigue now relaxed slightly, though tremors remained as a testament to the ordeal she had survived. Her mind drifted back to the desert for a fleeting moment, the sand stretching endlessly, the searing sun, the mirages that had tormented her, and the hallucinations that had tested her sanity. She shivered, not from cold, but from memory. She had faced all of it, alone, and had survived. The thought of what she had endured filled her with a quiet awe at her own strength. It was a survival story in the truest sense, and she had lived every agonizing, exhausting second of it. The SEALs ensured she was secure, one of them pressing a canteen to her lips again. She drank slowly this time, savoring the liquid, feeling it nourish her exhausted body. Her pulse gradually steadied, her breathing became more controlled, and a flicker of energy returned to her trembling limbs. She allowed herself to lean back, closing her eyes briefly, letting the noise of the helicopter and the vibrations of the rotors serve as a lullaby after the desert's unrelenting heat and isolation. As the helicopter climbed higher, leaving the desert floor behind, the sense of danger that had defined the last hours began to lift. She was safe, alive, and surrounded by skilled professional soldiers who had ensured her survival. The overwhelming relief mixed with exhaustion, creating a strange, surreal sensation. The desert had tested her to the limits of human endurance, and she had emerged alive. Her body was still weak, trembling from the accumulated strain, but her spirit was unbroken, stronger than it had ever been. For the first time in what felt like days, she allowed herself to feel pride, not boastful, but quiet, deep, and resolute. She had faced impossible conditions, fought against exhaustion and dehydration, and had survived. The SEALs around her, though maintaining their focus on the mission and safety protocols, recognized her achievement with subtle nods and glances of respect. Survival had been an individual effort, but rescue required the cooperation and skill of the team. Together, they had ensured the impossible, her survival. Even as she began to recover physically, she understood the psychological toll of the experience. The desert had tested not only her body, but her mind, pushing her to the brink of despair and forcing her to rely on willpower alone. The helicopter was now her sanctuary, the canopy under which she could begin to process the ordeals she had endured. Each movement she made was slow and deliberate, careful not to upset her exhausted body. Her senses, once overwhelmed by the desert, were now alert to new stimuli, the hum of the rotors, the voices of the seals, the vibration of the metal beneath her. As the helicopter carried her away from the desert, she reflected on the ordeal. The first hours of fear, the long stretch of heat, the hallucinations, and the extreme physical strain, all of it had been a test of survival in its purest form. She had endured, and now she had been lifted above the desert, her body and spirit battered but intact. Relief, pride, and gratitude mingled within her, forming a quiet, intense realization. She had survived the desert. She had survived the impossible. The helicopter hummed steadily as it carried her away from the vast, merciless expanse of desert she had just survived. Her body, still trembling from exhaustion and dehydration, lay stretched across the cabin floor, but her mind refused to slow down. Every detail of the ordeal replayed in vivid, almost painful clarity, the shifting dunes, the searing sun, the hallucinations, and the grueling hours of relentless struggle. For the first time, the enormity of what she had endured began to sink in. She had survived alone in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and she had survived long enough for a rescue that had seemed almost impossible. The SEALs around her worked silently, checking equipment, communicating with the pilot, and securing the cabin. Yet their eyes occasionally flicked toward her with a mixture of awe and respect. This was not simply a routine extraction. It was a testament to human endurance, a display of physical and mental fortitude that defied expectation. One of the senior SEALs leaned closer, voice low but filled with genuine admiration. You shouldn't have lasted this long. Most soldiers are down within hours. You pushed through every limit they taught us, and then some. She blinked, swallowing against the dryness in her throat, her lips cracked and sore. Her voice was hoarse, but she managed a faint nod. Words failed her at that moment. The effort to even speak required more energy than she could spare. Her mind, though exhausted, remained alert, processing the praise, the reality of survival, and the lingering disbelief that she had actually made it through the desert's unyielding test. The desert had demanded everything from her, and she had delivered. Every step, every breath, every decision had been a battle, and now the validation was coming from those who truly understood what survival meant. The helicopter rocked slightly as it navigated turbulent air, and she instinctively shifted her weight to maintain balance. Each movement reminded her how much her body had been pushed to its absolute limits. Her muscles ached, trembling under the strain, and her skin felt raw from sand, sun, and sweat. But in spite of the physical agony, a quiet pride began to seep into her consciousness. She had survived against odds that would have crushed almost anyone else. She had endured hunger, thirst, heat, fatigue, and isolation, and she had come through. The SEALs began preparing her for a more detailed assessment. One carefully checked her pulse, noting its steadiness despite the trauma of the desert. Another examined her hands and feet, blistered and swollen from hours of walking through the sand. Her uniform was torn and dust-encrusted, and her hair clung to her sweat-soaked face. Despite all this, the team marveled at the fact that she was still upright, still coherent, and still mentally alert. Most would be delirious by now, one muttered quietly to another, shaking his head in disbelief. She allowed herself to take small sips of water, savoring the cool liquid as it slid down her dry throat. The simple act, something so ordinary in the context of daily life, felt miraculous after the grueling hours of deprivation. Her body, starved for hydration, seemed to respond almost immediately, though fatigue still clung to every joint and muscle. Even so, she felt a subtle surge of strength, returning a reminder that the human body, when driven by determination, could endure far beyond expected limits. The helicopter cabin was filled with a strange mixture of noise and quiet observation. The rotors droned steadily, the vibrations rattled through the metal floor, and the wind whipped at open panels, yet the tension had shifted. Where moments ago there had been fear and uncertainty, there was now reflection, assessment, and awe. The team could see clearly the toll the desert had taken, but they could also see the indomitable spirit of the soldier who had refused to break. Every tremor of her limbs, every bead of sweat sliding across her cracked skin, was a testament to her extraordinary endurance. Her mind drifted back to the desert again, recalling the endless dunes and the scorching sun. She had been alone, with no shade, no water, and no backup, yet she had persevered. The hallucinations, the mirages, and the paralyzing fatigue had been overcome by sheer willpower. She realized, in a quiet, awestruck moment, that she had survived not only physically, but psychologically. Her mental fortitude had been tested just as severely as her body, and she had passed the trial with a strength that even she had not fully realized until now. The SEOs began to share their observations, voices low, professional, yet tinged with genuine astonishment. "You kept calm, stayed alert, and didn't let fatigue take your focus," one said. "Most soldiers in your condition start making mistakes, wander off, or collapse. You didn't. You adapted." She listened quietly, absorbing the praise, but also reflecting internally on how much it had cost her. Every step, every breath, every painful decision had been deliberate, fueled by instinct, training, and sheer determination. She shifted slightly to sit upright, careful not to jolt her exhausted body. Even the simple act of sitting was laborious, muscles trembling violently, but it was a small victory. One of the SEAL medics placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her through controlled movements to prevent further strain. "You're stronger than you think," he said, voice calm but impressed. She managed a faint, weary smile. Strength had taken on a new meaning over the past hours. It was no longer just physical endurance, but the ability to persevere mentally, emotionally, and strategically under extreme conditions. Her thoughts wandered to the moments in the desert when she had nearly succumbed. The hallucinations of water and shade, the dizziness and trembling, the paralyzing fatigue, those moments had been terrifying. Yet she had survived. Every decision to continue, every careful adjustment of movement, every instance of mental discipline had compounded into the triumph she now quietly experienced aboard the helicopter. She had endured the impossible. She had survived the desert alone. The helicopter began to descend toward a secure base, the vibrations of the rotors mingling with her racing thoughts. Relief surged through her in waves, punctuated by exhaustion so deep it threatened to collapse her entirely. She had survived the desert, been extracted under extreme conditions, and now, for the first time in hours or perhaps days, she could allow herself to truly rest. The SEALs ensured she was safely positioned, offering blankets and checking vitals, while she leaned back and let herself breathe. Amid the cabin's controlled chaos, a quiet moment emerged. The team, usually stoic and focused on operational efficiency, allowed themselves a rare glance of awe at her resilience. Surviving alone in the desert, with no water, had seemed improbable, yet she had achieved it. Every detail of her struggle-burned skin, blistered feet, cracked lips, trembling limbs told a story of determination beyond expectation. The silence between the SEALs was filled with unspoken respect. She had endured what few could, and they recognized it fully. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel an overwhelming wave of emotion. Relief, pride, gratitude, and disbelief mingling into one powerful realization. She had survived against overwhelming odds. The desert, a vast, unforgiving force, had tested her body and mind to extremes. Yet she had not only endured, but thrived in the face of adversity. Her endurance had been extraordinary, and the respect she received from those who had witnessed it reinforced the magnitude of her accomplishment. The helicopter touched down at the secure base, its metal wheels skimming the tarmac with a muted thud. She felt the final vibration pass through her, signaling the end of her immediate ordeal. Yet even as she prepared to step out of the aircraft, she understood the full significance of what she had survived. Hours of scorching heat, parching thirst, isolation, and mental strain had culminated in this moment of triumph. She was alive, unbroken, and stronger than ever. The SEALs helped her out of the helicopter, each movement careful to accommodate her exhaustion. She stepped onto solid ground, the relief of stability washing over her. Her body was trembling, but her spirit soared. Every step from here on would be easier than the grueling hours in the desert, yet she knew she had been changed irrevocably. The desert had tested her limits, and she had emerged victorious. The base was a flurry of activity as the helicopter touched down, yet to her, the world felt still for the first time in what seemed like days. The blinding sun of the desert had been replaced with the harsh fluorescent lights of the command center and the steady hum of human activity. Every step she took was deliberate. Her legs still trembled, her muscles stiff and sore, but she no longer fought for survival in the rawest sense. Here, she was safe. The desert was behind her. And yet, the memory of its relentless heat, the taste of dust, the scorching sun, and the paralyzing fatigue lingered, seared into her mind. The medics approached immediately, guiding her to a medical station. They checked her vitals, pulse, blood pressure, hydration levels, and core temperature. Each beep of the monitoring equipment underscored the reality of what she had endured. Hours alone in the desert with no water had pushed her body to the brink, yet she had remained upright, coherent, and mentally alert, a testament not only to her physical conditioning, but to her extraordinary mental fortitude. The medics exchanged looks of astonishment. Even among elite soldiers, her endurance exceeded expectations. As they helped her sip fluids and provided nutrition, she reflected on the moments that had brought her here. The shifting dunes that had threatened to swallow her with every step, the illusions of water that had teased her mind, and the burning heat that had tested every cell in her body. They were memories that now carried a dual meaning, trauma and triumph. Each hallucination, each staggering step across the sand, each agonizing moment of thirst had been a test, and she had passed them all. She had survived alone, relying on instinct, training, and sheer willpower. The commanding officer approached, his expression a mix of respect and incredulity. "You've set a new standard," he said, voice firm but reverent. "We didn't expect anyone to last this long out there. What you've done, your endurance, your focus, your mental clarity is extraordinary. You've proven what human determination can accomplish." She nodded quietly, still processing the intensity of the praise. Words felt inadequate. Hours of suffering, every blister, every dry swallow, every hallucination, all culminated in this moment of acknowledgement. She had endured the impossible, and now it was being recognized. The debriefing that followed was both meticulous and celebratory. She recounted every detail of the ordeal, from the initial drop into the desert, the precise steps she had taken to conserve energy, to the critical moments of hallucination that had tested her sanity. Every nuance mattered. Her methods, instinctive yet informed by training, had allowed her to survive. Her mental strategies, breaking down the environment, counting steps, focusing on microtasks, had been as vital as her physical resilience. The team recorded each insight, knowing that her experience could guide future missions and survival protocols. As she spoke, she noticed the reactions around her. Fellow soldiers, medics, and officers alike were visibly impressed. Some nodded, silently acknowledging her strength. Others exchanged glances, the disbelief barely masked. It wasn't just that she had survived, it was how she had survived. Alone, alert, and mentally disciplined in conditions that would have broken almost anyone. The desert had demanded total surrender from those unprepared for its extremity, and she had refused to yield. Her story was already becoming legend within the base, a vivid example of what perseverance and discipline could accomplish. In the quiet moments that followed the debriefing, she allowed herself to process her emotions fully. Relief washed over her first, a wave so powerful it left her momentarily dizzy. She had survived the desert. Every calculation, every careful step, every moment of mental focus had led to this instant. Then came gratitude to the SEALs who had risked their lives to extract her, to the medics ensuring her recovery, to the support team coordinating the helicopter rescue. She had been alone in the desert, yet she had never truly been without help, even if that help only arrived at the 11th hour. Pride followed, a quiet, resilient pride that settled deep in her chest. She had endured the harshest conditions imaginable, faced hallucinations, exhaustion, and dehydration, yet she had remained upright, coherent, and alert. Most would have faltered, yet she had pressed forward, step by agonizing step, guided by a mixture of instinct, training, and sheer determination. She had discovered depths of strength she had never realized she possessed. In the mirror of her reflection, there was a soldier transformed, not just by the physical ordeal, but by the mental and emotional clarity it had forced her to achieve. The medical team ensured that she rested adequately, providing hydration, nutrition, and monitoring for any delayed effects of heat exhaustion or dehydration. Her body, though battered, began to stabilize. Each heartbeat returned to a measured rhythm, muscles slowly losing some of their tremor, and her breathing became calmer. Yet despite the relief and recovery, a mental and emotional awareness lingered. The desert had tested her, and she had survived, leaving an indelible mark on her psyche. The endurance she had demonstrated would shape her future, infusing every mission, every decision, every step she took with newfound confidence and resilience. Later, she was granted a private moment to reflect. Standing by the base perimeter, she gazed across the landscape, thinking of the desert now miles away. The vast expanse of sand, the sun beating down without mercy, and the hallucinations that had plagued her now felt both distant and immediate, a paradox of memory and experience. She realized that survival was more than physical endurance. It was the cultivation of patience, strategic thinking, and mental clarity. Each decision, each movement, and each breath had been critical. In the desert, there were no second chances. She thought of the helicopter, of the SEALs, and of the moment of extraction. That instant, suspended between life and potential disaster, had crystallized the magnitude of human resilience. Her body had been pushed to its limits, yet her mind had remained sharp. She had endured, she had adapted, and she had survived. It was a lesson not just in survival, but in the potential of human determination to overcome extreme adversity. She had discovered a wellspring of strength she had never fully appreciated, a strength forged in the crucible of the desert. Word of her survival spread quickly among the base personnel. Officers, fellow soldiers, and support staff alike recognized the extraordinary nature of her achievement. She had endured a situation that most considered unsurvivable, yet she had emerged not only alive, but coherent, mentally disciplined, and capable of detailed reflection. Her experience became a case study in resilience, a living example of the human capacity to endure under extreme stress. Even seasoned veterans were impressed, acknowledging that her survival was a testament to extraordinary courage and discipline. As the days passed, her recovery continued. Physical therapy, hydration, and rest gradually restored her strength. Each day she reflected on her journey, the isolation, the physical agony, the hallucinations, and the strategic decisions that had guided her through the desert. She realized that her survival was not an accident, but the culmination of training, mental focus, and unyielding determination. The desert had tested her every limit, yet she had persevered. That realization was both humbling and empowering. Finally, as she prepared to return to active duty, she felt a profound shift within herself. The desert had demanded the utmost from her body, mind, and spirit, and she had delivered. The ordeal had transformed her, instilling a new sense of confidence, resilience, and respect for the unpredictable forces of nature. She understood, more clearly than ever, that survival was not simply about enduring physical pain. It was about mastering the mind, maintaining focus, and trusting in one's own resilience. The desert, once a vast and merciless enemy, had become a teacher. It had pushed her to limits she had never imagined, and had rewarded her with insight, endurance, and a deep understanding of her own strength. She had faced isolation, extreme heat, dehydration, and mental strain, and had emerged victorious. In the story of her life, this chapter would stand as a monument to perseverance, courage, and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and triumph. As she looked toward the horizon, she carried with her the lessons of the desert. Each challenge she had faced, each agonizing step, each hallucination, had become a symbol of resilience. She had survived what many could not, endured what few would attempt, and now, stronger and wiser, she was ready to continue her journey with the knowledge that no adversity, no matter how extreme, could break her spirit.